There is a photograph that does not exist but should. It would show a woman in a cotton house dress standing at the edge of her backyard in St. George, Utah, sometime in the spring of 1953. Her laundry is on the line. White sheets, a child's dress, a man's cotton undershirts. Behind her, somewhere beyond the Joshua trees and the red rock mesas that define the southwestern Utah horizon, something enormous is happening. The air is not right. There is a kind of pressure in it, and a shimmer and a distant sound that is less a sound than a concussion in the chest, a feeling almost biological in its intimacy. She knows what it is. Everyone in St. George knows what it is by now. They have been told it is safe. They have been told the wind goes the other way. They have been told that the men in suits from the Atomic Energy Commission have measured everything, calculated everything, and that nothing harmful will reach them. They believe this because they are patriots and because they are trusting and because the alternative, that their government might knowingly expose them to radiation for the sake of weapons testing schedules, is not something that fits inside the world they understand themselves to inhabit. The woman takes her laundry in anyway. Some instinct older than the atomic age tells her to. She folds the sheets and sets them on the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and goes to the kitchen to start dinner. Her children are at school. The mountains to the north are still faintly visible through the kitchen window. By tomorrow, a fine white ash will have settled on everything, on her garden, on her fence posts, on the empty clothesline. Her neighbors will see it too. One of them, a man named Elmer Pickett who ran a gas station on the edge of town, will later recall that people scraped the powder off their car hoods and called the AEC to ask about it. They were told it was harmless, that it was ordinary road dust, that they should not worry. What happened to those people across the next 2 decades? The cancers, the miscarriages, the children who grew sick before they grew up, is one of the most documented and most persistently misunderstood stories in American history. It is a story about the gap between what a government tells its citizens and what it knows to be true. It is a story about a particular kind of courage, not the courage of soldiers or astronauts, but the courage required to believe that you have been wronged by the very institution whose protection you believed in absolutely. It is a story about the peculiar psychology of the nuclear age, when the atom was simultaneously the most terrifying and the most gloriously promising thing that human beings had ever encountered. And it is a story about what happens when history is not suppressed by force or by censorship, but by something far more ordinary: official reassurance, bureaucratic convenience, and the quiet human desire not to know what cannot be unfound. This is the story of the downwinders, and it begins not in the desert of Nevada, but in the offices and conference rooms where decisions were made that those families in Utah and Nevada and Arizona would never know about until it was far too late. To understand what the American government chose to do in the Nevada desert beginning in January of 1951, you need to understand the specific terror of the years that preceded that decision. The Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear device in August of 1949, nearly 4 years ahead of American intelligence estimates. The shock that ran through Washington was not merely strategic, it was existential in a way that is difficult to reconstruct from this distance. American policymakers had understood the post-war world as a period of unchallenged nuclear primacy. The bomb was supposed to be the ultimate guarantor of American security, the technological edge that made a Third World War not merely undesirable, but impossible. When a Soviet bomber appeared over Siberia and the seismic stations and atmospheric monitoring equipment registered that unmistakable signature, the isotopic fingerprint of a plutonium implosion, that certainty collapsed overnight. In June of 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, and the United States found itself in a shooting war on the Asian peninsula. The possibility that this was a Soviet probe, the opening move in a larger conflict, could not be dismissed. Harry Truman's National Security Council produced a document, that Autumn NSC 68, which called for a dramatic and immediate expansion of American military capability. The document argued that the United States was falling dangerously behind the Soviet Union and that the window of American advantage was closing rapidly. Among its recommendations was an accelerated program of nuclear weapons development and testing. The problem with testing was geography. The United States had been conducting its nuclear tests in the Pacific at Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok. These tests were enormous operations requiring months of preparation, hundreds of ships, thousands of personnel, and considerable diplomatic management, with the populations being displaced and disrupted by the program. They were also slow. In the new strategic environment, the weapons laboratories at Los Alamos and the emerging facility at Livermore needed faster feedback loops. They needed to test designs, refine yields, explore new configurations of fissile material, and do all of this on a pace compatible with the urgent demands of the arms race. In the autumn of 1950, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense surveyed potential domestic testing sites. They needed distance from major population centers, consistent atmospheric conditions, federal land ownership to minimize complications, and the right geology. They settled on a parcel of desert in southern Nevada, approximately 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. It had previously been used as a bombing range during the Second World War. The topography was flat and open. The prevailing winds, the AEC's meteorologists reported, generally moved northeast over unpopulated desert terrain. Generally, that word would carry an enormous weight in the years to come. The Nevada Proving Ground was officially established by presidential directive on December 18, 1950. The first test, a 1-kiloton device dropped from a B-50 bomber, was detonated on January 27, 1951. It was called Able, and it was the opening shot of a testing program that would run, with interruptions and pauses, for more than a decade, until the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 drove the tests underground. What the AEC knew at the outset, and what it did not share with the communities downwind, requires careful excavation. The science of radiation and its biological effects was not in 1951 as complete as it would later become. That much is true and must be acknowledged with precision. There were genuine uncertainties. The relationship between specific doses of ionizing radiation and specific cancer outcomes was not fully understood and would not be fully understood for decades. But the AEC was not operating in a complete scientific vacuum. It had its own researchers. It had access to the medical data being generated by the physicians treating the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, data gathered by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission beginning in 1947. It had internal risk assessments, and what those assessments showed repeatedly was that the populations living downwind of the Nevada tests were receiving doses of radiation that, even by the conservative models of the era, were not trivially small. The official position, maintained with remarkable consistency across multiple administrations and AEC chairmen, was that the tests posed no danger to the public. This position was not supported by the internal evidence. It was, in the bluntest sense of the phrase, a lie of reassurance, a decision made at the highest levels of the national security establishment that public calm and testing continuity mattered more than full disclosure. The men who made that decision were not monsters. Most of them were, in the context of their time and their responsibilities, doing what they genuinely believed was necessary. That is precisely what makes the story so difficult and so important. The communities to the north and northeast of the Nevada test site were small, largely rural, and deeply patriotic. St. George, Utah had a population of approximately 5,000 in 1953. Cedar City, slightly to the north, was smaller still. The ranching and farming communities of southern Nevada and northwestern Arizona were even more scattered. These were predominantly Mormon communities, deeply rooted in their landscape, with a theological orientation that emphasized service, obedience, and a trust in legitimate authority. When the AEC's representatives came to speak at community meetings and church halls, when they handed out informational pamphlets with reassuring language and diagrams showing wind patterns that drifted conveniently away from population centers, they were received with the assumption of good faith that these communities extended to their government almost automatically. This was not naivety. It was a form of social contract, perhaps the most fundamental form. The expectation that those who hold power over you will not use that power to harm you while telling you that you are safe. That contract for the people of the Nevada, Utah, Arizona corridor was about to be broken in ways that would take a generation to fully comprehend. The year 1953 represents the hinge point in the history of the downwinders, the year when the scale of the exposure became impossible to explain away, and when the first official evasions became, in retrospect, clearly and deliberately false. Operation Upshot Knothole ran from March through June of 1953, and it was, by the metrics of the testing program, a productive series. 11 detonations, a range of yields, useful data for the weapons designers at Los Alamos. It also produced, on May 19, 1953, a test that people who lived through it never forgot. Shot Harry, nicknamed Dirty Harry by the test workers themselves because of the unusual volume of radioactive debris it produced, was a 32-kiloton device detonated from a tower at the Nevada test site. The fireball rose, the shock wave rolled outward, and the cloud moved northeast. The cloud moved directly over St. George, Utah. Elmer Pickett, the gas station owner, later testified that the sky turned yellow. Others described a metallic taste in the air, a gritty film on their skin, a smell that did not belong to the desert. Children were at school. Farmers were in their fields. The townspeople went about their day because they had been told to go about their day. The AEC had a monitoring team in St. George, and those monitors recorded radiation levels that were, according to AEC documents later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, substantially higher than publicly reported. The AEC's own published limit for what it considered an acceptable exposure to the general public was 3.9 roentgens over the course of a 13-week period. The monitoring data from St. George on May 19 and the days immediately following showed exposures well in excess of AEC guidance levels. The AEC's response was to revise its public statements while maintaining internally that no danger existed. Gordon Dean, the AEC chairman, was briefed on the St. George situation. The internal record shows awareness, discussion, and a choice to continue testing, to continue public reassurance, and to deal with any future health consequences if and when they became undeniable. They did not become undeniable quickly enough to inconvenience the testing program. The same spring, in the grazing country east of the test site, something unmistakable happened that could not be easily explained away. Sheep herders in the range country of Millard and Iron counties in Utah began bringing their flocks down from summer pasture to find animals that were sick, losing wool, developing lesions around the mouth and on the legs, dying in numbers that had no precedent in the ranchers' experience. By summer, more than 4,000 sheep were dead or dying. The ranchers applied to the AEC for compensation, claiming that the animals had been exposed to radioactive fallout from the spring tests. The AEC sent investigators. The investigators documented the lesions and the deaths and the timeline, and then, in the official report, they attributed the losses to malnutrition and unusual winter conditions. The ranchers, men who had worked that land for generations and who knew what malnourished sheep looked like, were told that they did not know what they were looking at. One of those ranchers was a man named Kern Bullock, who ran cattle and sheep on the range outside Cedar City. Bullock's testimony, preserved in court records from a later lawsuit, describes the AEC investigators arriving in government vehicles, taking samples, making notes, and then producing a report that bore no recognizable relationship to what he had shown them. He was not a man given to conspiracy theories. He was a working rancher who had suffered a catastrophic loss and who could not understand why the men from Washington seemed more interested in protecting a conclusion than in understanding what had actually happened. His account is repeated with variations by every rancher who went through the same process. The pattern is uniform: documentation, investigation, exoneration of the tests. We now know from documents declassified in the 1980s and 1990s that the AEC's own laboratory analysis of the sheep tissues showed pathology consistent with radiation exposure. The Hanford Laboratory, one of the AEC's own facilities, produced reports in 1953 concluding that the lesions on the Utah sheep were characteristic of beta radiation burns. Those reports were not forwarded to the compensation reviewers. They were classified and filed. The human cost of the 1953 tests did not become visible as quickly as the sheep deaths. Cancer has a latency period. The diseases that ionizing radiation causes, leukemia, thyroid cancer, bone cancer, various solid tumors, do not announce themselves in the weeks after exposure. They surface years later, sometimes a decade later, and by the time they do, the epidemiological link to a specific radiation event is difficult to establish to the satisfaction of a legal or scientific standard designed around other kinds of causation. It was this latency that gave the official position its staying power. People got sick and died, but people always get sick and die, and the machinery of official denial was able to interpose itself between the pattern and the explanation for long enough to prevent any single coherent account from forming. Claudia Peterson grew up in St. George. Her family was there for the tests. By the time she was an adult, she had watched her mother, her aunts, her neighbors, and eventually her own children experience cancers and illness at rates that she knew, in the way that people who have lived inside a thing know it, were not ordinary. Peterson became one of the central figures in what would eventually be called the downwinder movement, a loose coalition of individuals and families from Utah, Nevada, and Arizona who began in the late 1970s and through the 1980s to connect their personal histories of illness to the testing program and to demand acknowledgement and compensation. She was not a scientist or a lawyer. She was a woman who had watched people she loved die and who refused to accept the explanation that nothing was responsible. Her activism was of the most unglamorous and tenacious kind. Sitting in archives, reading documents, organizing community meetings, speaking to legislators who were not always interested in listening. Her congressional testimony in the late 1970s is a model of controlled, evidence-based emotional argument. Specific, personal, documented, and utterly impossible to dismiss except by those who were determined to dismiss it. The scientist whose work most directly threatened the official position was not a dissident or a whistleblower in any dramatic sense. He was an AEC employee named Harold Knapp, and he was in the early 1960s doing exactly the work he had been hired to do, analyzing the relationship between nuclear fallout and radiation exposure in the human population. Knapp's analysis, completed in 1962 and circulated internally at the AEC, reached a conclusion that the Commission's public position could not accommodate. The AEC had been calculating public exposure from fallout using a methodology that focused primarily on external gamma radiation, the kind you could measure with a Geiger counter held in the air. Knapp examined a different pathway, the milk pathway. Fallout settles on grass. Cattle and dairy goats eat the grass. The radioactive iodine, specifically iodine-131, a fission product with an 8-day half-life, concentrates in the milk. Children drink the milk. The thyroid gland, which has a specific affinity for iodine and which in children is both smaller and more metabolically active than in adults, absorbs the iodine-131 with particular efficiency. When Knapp ran the numbers on this pathway for the Utah dairy farming communities during the 1953 tests, the doses he calculated for children were, by his own description, startling. They were vastly higher than the AEC's official exposure estimates, in some cases by factors of 10 to 100. His report was classified. He was pressured to revise his methodology. He declined. He eventually left the AEC. His analysis, when it was finally obtained by journalists and researchers in the 1970s, provided the quantitative foundation that the downwinder movement had needed. Not an argument about feelings or memory, but a technically rigorous calculation from inside the government's own research apparatus, showing that children in southwestern Utah had received radiation doses to their thyroids that should not, by any responsible standard, have been characterized as safe. The Knapp Report's suppression is perhaps the most consequential single act of information management in the entire history of the domestic testing program. It is not that it would have ended the tests by 1962 when Knapp completed his analysis. The testing program was already winding down under the pressure of the limited test ban treaty negotiations. But it would have provided, at a moment when people were still alive and when medical intervention was still possible, a factual basis for identifying the most exposed populations and monitoring their health. That intervention never happened. The legal reckoning came, belatedly, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A federal lawsuit, Allen v. United States, was filed in the District of Utah in 1979, representing a group of plaintiffs from the downwind communities who alleged that the AEC and its successor agency, the Energy Research and Development Administration, had been negligent in conducting the tests and in monitoring and reporting the public's exposure. The presiding judge was Bruce Jenkins, and his handling of the case stands as one of the most meticulous pieces of judicial work in the history of federal radiation litigation. Jenkins heard the case without a jury, as federal tort cases of this kind were conducted, and over the course of several years, he examined a documentary record of extraordinary depth. His 1984 ruling, published as a formal opinion that runs to more than 200 pages, found in favor of 24 of the plaintiffs, concluding that the government had been negligent and that the specific cancers in those cases had been caused by their radiation exposure from the Nevada tests. His findings of fact are a detailed indictment not merely of the testing practices, but of the deliberate suppression of information and the misrepresentation of risk to the affected communities. The government appealed. In 1987, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Jenkins' ruling not on the facts but on a legal doctrine known as the discretionary function exception, which shields the federal government from liability for policy decisions made in the exercise of official judgment. The government had, the appeals court found, made a policy judgment about how to balance testing requirements against public safety, and even if that judgment was wrong or negligent, the discretionary function exception immunized it from liability in tort. The legal analysis was defensible, the moral result was not. 24 people whose cancers a federal judge had found to have been caused by their government's deliberate negligence were left without remedy because the mechanism of their harm had been a policy decision rather than an operational accident. Gordon Elliott White, a journalist for the Deseret News in Salt Lake City, had been covering the Downwinder story since the mid-1970s. His reporting, among the earliest sustained journalistic investigation of the testing program's health consequences, helped create the factual and political context within which the Allen lawsuit became possible. White's work illustrates the particular role that regional journalism played in this story. The national press had largely accepted the AEC's framing of the testing program as a necessary and manageable risk, while the local reporters who covered the communities where the consequences were being felt developed a very different understanding of what had actually happened. Howard Ball's 1986 book, Justice Downwind: America's Atomic Testing Program in the 1950s, was the first comprehensive scholarly account of the testing program and its health consequences. Ball, a political scientist at the University of Utah, had access to many of the then recently declassified documents, and his reconstruction of the AEC's internal deliberations remains one of the essential accounts of how official knowledge and official public position diverged so dramatically during the testing years. The legislative response came in 1990 with the passage of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The law established a compensation fund for individuals who could demonstrate that they had been present in the designated downwind counties during the period of atmospheric testing and who had developed one of a specified list of cancers. The amounts were modest: $50,000 for downwinders, $100,000 for workers at the test site itself. The list of compensable cancers was narrower than the scientific evidence supported. The geographic boundaries of the covered areas excluded populations in Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Idaho who had received doses comparable to those in the covered Utah counties. But the law was, at minimum, a formal acknowledgment by the United States Congress that something had been done to these people that required remedy. The acknowledgment came 40 years after Shot Harry crossed the sky above St. George. Why did it take 4 decades? The question is not rhetorical. It has specific documentary answers, and those answers illuminate something important about the relationship between institutional knowledge, official narrative, and historical reckoning in democratic societies. The first reason is the structure of nuclear secrecy. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 established an extraordinarily broad framework of classification that covered not merely weapons designs and deployment strategies, but also any information related to the effects of nuclear weapons that might be deemed sensitive to national security. This classification authority was interpreted expansively. Internal AEC reports documenting radiation exposure in the downwind communities, studies of fallout pathways, analyses of livestock and soil contamination. All of this could be and frequently was classified on the grounds that its disclosure would provide information useful to potential adversaries about the characteristics and yields of American weapons. The classification system was not designed as a tool for concealing harm to American citizens, but it was perfectly suited to that function, and it was used that way. The second reason is the psychology of the Cold War domestic consensus. The 1950s were, in the United States, a period of remarkable ideological conformity around certain foundational propositions: that the Soviet threat was real and existential, that the maintenance of American nuclear superiority was a patriotic necessity, and that citizens had an obligation to accept certain sacrifices in the service of national defense. The AEC was skilled at operating within this consensus. When community leaders in St. George raised questions about the white powder on their fences, they were told, in effect, that their concerns, however understandable, needed to be weighed against the needs of a nation facing a nuclear-armed adversary. The implicit message was clear. To press the question was to be, in some sense, on the wrong side of the central moral contest of the era. This was not an argument that people in rural Utah in the 1950s were well positioned to resist. The third reason involves what the historian D. Garceau has called the geography of sacrifice, the tendency of centralized governments to concentrate the costs of national projects in communities that are geographically remote, economically marginal, and politically underrepresented. The downwinder communities were not, by any measure, at the center of American political life. They were small, rural, Mormon, Western communities that the national political establishment could ignore without consequence in ways that communities closer to the centers of power could not be ignored. The Nevada test site was not located 65 miles from Las Vegas by accident. It was located there in part because the terrain downwind was sparsely populated, and in part because the populations that were there occupied a position of minimal political leverage. The same logic governed the placement of uranium mines on Navajo lands, the selection of Bikini Atoll for Pacific testing, the routing of nuclear waste through Native American territory. The geography of the Cold War's domestic costs was not random. It followed the lines of least political resistance with considerable precision. The fourth reason, and perhaps the most philosophically troubling, is the phenomenon that the science and technology scholar Brian Wynn has described as the institutionalization of ignorance, the active organizational management of what is not known as distinct from what is known and suppressed. The AEC, beginning in the early 1950s, made a series of decisions about what research to fund, what data to collect, what studies to conduct, that had the effect of ensuring that certain questions about radiation and public health could not be definitively answered. If you do not establish a cancer registry in the downwind communities, you cannot produce epidemiological data showing elevated cancer rates. If you do not fund prospective health studies of the exposed populations, you cannot document dose-response relationships. If you define the relevant exposure pathway as external gamma radiation and do not investigate the milk pathway that Harold Knapp would later identify, you cannot be confronted with the numbers that Knapp's analysis eventually produced. The AEC did not, in the main, need to suppress information that it had gathered. It could simply decline to gather it. This is a subtler and more difficult form of institutional deception than outright falsification, because it is often indistinguishable from the normal operation of any large bureaucracy with limited resources making choices about research priorities. Only in retrospect, when the pattern of what was not studied becomes visible against the background of what was already known, does the shape of the deliberate avoidance emerge. There is a parallel dynamic in the cultural history of the atomic age that deserves examination. The 1950s were simultaneously the era of maximum nuclear anxiety and the era of most aggressive nuclear cheerleading. The same culture that produced civil defense manuals, backyard fallout shelters, and the duck and cover drills that are now primarily remembered as dark comedy also produced Atoms for Peace, Nuclear Medicine, The Promise of Electricity Too Cheap to Meter, and an entire aesthetic vocabulary of atomic optimism in which the symbol of the mushroom cloud was repurposed as a logo for modernity. The Federal Civil Defense Administration, which was responsible for educating the public about nuclear preparedness, produced an extraordinary volume of material in the early 1950s designed to normalize the nuclear threat, to transform it from something that inspired paralysis into something that could be managed through rational preparation and civic cooperation. The 1951 short film Duck and Cover, starring the cartoon turtle Bert, taught school children that a nuclear attack was survivable if they moved quickly to a protected position. The 1955 publication of the FCDA's guide, Survival Under Atomic Attack, offered reassurance that you can survive an atomic bomb, provided you followed the correct procedures. This normalization project served the testing program directly. If atomic bombs were something that ordinary Americans could protect themselves from by crouching under a school desk or sheltering in a prepared basement, then the idea that living 60 miles downwind of a test site and occasionally seeing a distant mushroom cloud constituted a serious health risk became conceptually dissonant. The cultural frame that the government was constructing, bomb as manageable threat, preparedness as adequate protection, made it very difficult for people to believe that invisible radioactive particles drifting on the wind were doing something that no amount of personal preparedness could address. The downwinder communities, in accepting the AEC's reassurances, were not simply being gullible. They were operating within a carefully constructed informational and cultural environment designed to make acceptance the natural response. Understanding this does not exonerate the AEC or absolve the individuals who made the decisions. It does help explain how a population of intelligent, observant, deeply invested people could watch their children get sick and not immediately understand why. Dr. Lyon and colleagues at the University of Utah School of Medicine published in the New England Journal of Medicine in January of 1979 the first peer-reviewed epidemiological study of cancer mortality in the downwinder counties. The study examined leukemia mortality rates in children in southern Utah counties between 1944 and 1975, comparing the pre-testing period to the testing period and the post-testing period. The results showed a statistically significant increase in childhood leukemia mortality during the testing years, an increase that was not observed in comparable Utah counties outside the downwind zone. The Lyon study did not prove causation to every scientist's satisfaction, and it generated considerable methodological controversy, some of it genuine and some of it funded by parties with interests in discrediting it, but it broke the epidemiological silence. For the first time, there was a peer-reviewed published finding in a major medical journal that the children of the downwind communities had died of leukemia at elevated rates during the years when nuclear fallout was passing over their homes. The AEC, by 1979, no longer existed. It had been abolished in 1974, and its functions divided between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Energy Research and Development Administration, which became the Department of Energy in 1977. There was no single institutional heir to defend the testing program's legacy. What there was, instead, was a diffuse bureaucratic resistance across multiple agencies, a resistance fueled not by any central policy, but by the ordinary institutional dynamics of organizations that had interests in not being held responsible for things that had happened on their predecessors' watch. The story of how that resistance was eventually overcome, through journalism, through litigation, through congressional testimony, through the accumulation of declassified documents, through the sustained, unglamorous political organizing of people like Claudia Peterson who refused to let the question be closed, is a story about a particular kind of democratic accountability. It is not the kind of accountability that produces dramatic courtroom victories or congressional apologies from officials who ordered the tests. The men who ordered Shot Harry were dead or retired or unavailable. What the downwinders achieved after 40 years was something more modest and perhaps more durable: the formal recognition by the Congress of the United States that they had been harmed, that the harm had been caused by government action, and that they were owed something in acknowledgment of that harm. That recognition is incomplete. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act has been extended and amended multiple times since 1990, most recently with significant expansions debated in the early 2020s, but it has never fully encompassed the range of people and conditions for which the evidence of harm exists. Navajo uranium miners who developed lung cancer and other diseases from working in the mines that fed the testing program were covered under a separate compensation pathway, but the processing of those claims has been persistently slow and the amounts awarded have consistently fallen short of what the health impact warrants. New Mexico, where the Trinity test, the first nuclear detonation in history on July 16, 1945, exposed the surrounding population to fallout before any of the infrastructure of civil defense or community reassurance had been put in place, was for decades excluded from any compensation program at all. The populations downwind of Trinity, largely Hispanic and Native American farming communities in the Tularosa Basin, experienced elevated rates of disease without any of the minimal acknowledgement that the Utah downwinders eventually received. The history of the downwinders raises questions that have not expired with the Cold War. They have, if anything, become more urgent as the machinery that produced the testing program has been applied in contexts beyond the nuclear. The first question is about the structure of informed consent in a democracy. The communities around the Nevada test site were not asked whether they consented to serve as the involuntary test subjects for a program they knew nothing about. They were told, repeatedly and with the full authority of the national security establishment, that they were not test subjects at all, that the tests were safe, that the fallout was harmless, that the experts had everything under control. This was false. The falseness was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate decisions made by identifiable individuals who weighed the costs of disclosure against the benefits of testing continuity and chose continuity. The theoretical foundations of democratic governance rest on the premise that citizens have a right to information that affects their lives and their health, and that governments which possess such information are obligated to share it. The Downwinder case is a demonstration, precise and thoroughly documented, of what happens when that obligation is set aside in the name of national security. It is not a marginal case or an exceptional abuse. It was official policy maintained across multiple administrations, involving thousands of civil servants and scientists and administrators for more than a decade. If it was possible in the particular historical and institutional circumstances of the 1950s, the questions it raises about those circumstances have not been answered by the passage of time. The second question is about the geography of sacrifice. The communities that bore the cost of the testing program were not chosen randomly. They were chosen in part precisely because they were marginal, geographically remote, politically underrepresented, economically dependent on federal land policies that made confrontation with federal agencies risky. The same logic has governed other distributions of environmental and health risk across American history. The placement of petrochemical facilities in low-income communities, the routing of hazardous waste to rural areas, the siting of pollution-generating industries adjacent to communities with limited political capacity to resist. The downwinder story is continuous with these other stories. It belongs to a broader pattern of concentrated risk and distributed benefit that characterizes the management of hazardous activities in societies where political power is unequally distributed. The third question is about memory and the mechanisms through which uncomfortable history is preserved or lost. The downwinder story is not unknown. There is a substantial scholarly literature, a congressional record, a compensation program, a body of journalism and documentary work, but it does not occupy the place in the general cultural understanding of the 1950s that its scale and significance would seem to warrant. The atomic family of the 1950s cultural imagination is still primarily a figure of suburban comfort, of television sets and tail-fin automobiles and backyard barbecues. Not a figure standing at the edge of a contaminated yard watching the laundry dry in air that the government knows is not safe. Why that substitution persists is worth considering. Partly it is because the testing story complicates the Cold War narrative that most Americans prefer, the story of a democracy that faced an unprecedented threat and responded with technological prowess and moral resolve. The downwinder story does not contradict that narrative exactly, but it insists on a cost that the triumphalist version of Cold War history prefers to omit. Partly it is because the harm was diffuse and statistical, not a single dramatic event, but a pattern of elevated cancer mortality spread over decades and across hundreds of square miles, which makes it less suited to the commemorative practices that attach to discrete historical events. And partly it is because the people who bore the cost were not, by most measures, the kind of people whose suffering gets inscribed into the central narrative. They were rural, working class, geographically marginal, members of a religious minority. The stories we tell about the 1950s are not primarily their stories. Harold Knapp, the AEC scientist who calculated the real thyroid doses to children in the downwind communities and whose report was classified and suppressed, spent the rest of his career. He eventually left the AEC and worked as an independent consultant, trying to ensure that his findings were incorporated into the historical record. He testified before Congress, he published, he gave interviews, he died in 2004. It is difficult to read the account of his professional life after the suppression of his 1962 report without sensing in it the particular kind of desolation that comes from knowing something important that the institutions around you are organized to not know. He was not a hero in any dramatic sense. He was a scientist who did careful work and told the truth about it and was punished for that in the quiet, bureaucratic ways that institutions punish people who produce inconvenient findings. His name belongs in any serious account of this history, and the fact that it is not more widely known is itself a comment on what kinds of institutional behavior our commemorative practices are designed to recognize. Claudia Peterson, who spent decades organizing the downwinder communities and testifying before Congress, offered a formulation in her testimony that has stayed with everyone who has read it. She was describing what it was like to grow up in St. George in the 1950s, to remember the mushroom clouds on the horizon, to watch her neighbors sicken and die over the following decades, and then to learn from the declassified documents that the people who had told her community that everything was safe had known it was not safe. She said, "We were model citizens. We trusted our government. We did everything we were asked to do. We didn't ask for much in return. We just wanted to be told the truth." The sentence is too simple for the complexity of what she was describing, but simplicity in this context is not a failure of understanding. It is the appropriate register for a demand that should not have required demanding, the expectation fundamental to any meaningful account of democratic citizenship that the government which holds information relevant to your life and your health will not choose, for reasons of administrative convenience or strategic advantage, to withhold it while telling you that you have nothing to worry about. The Nevada desert, in the years between 1951 and 1963, was the site of 100 atmospheric nuclear tests. The clouds from those tests did not, in the main, drift over unpopulated desert. They drifted over farms and ranches and small towns and school playgrounds, over gardens and water tanks and dairy herds, over communities whose members had every reason to expect that the country they loved and served was not conducting experiments on their bodies without their knowledge. What the downwinders ultimately demanded, and what they eventually partially incompletely received, was not revenge and not even justice in any full sense. It was acknowledgment, the recognition that they had been present at a specific place and time, that something had been done to them there, that the people who did it knew what they were doing, and that this ought to be part of the story we tell about the decade in which it happened. The story of the 1950s that we tell most comfortably is about prosperity and conformity and the opening notes of cultural transformation. It is a story in which the atomic age is primarily a background condition, menacing, yes, but ultimately managed, ultimately contained. The Downwinder story refuses that containment. It says, look at the actual cost, look at the actual people, look at what was done to them and what they were told and what was known and what was hidden. And then ask yourself whether a version of the decade that leaves this out is actually history, or whether it is simply a comfortable story dressed in the clothes of one. That is not a rhetorical question. It is a diagnostic one. The answer you arrive at will tell you something not about the 1950s, but about the uses to which you are putting the past. The laundry on the line in St. George, the white powder on the fence posts in the morning, the children in school on May 19, 1953, while the cloud moved over the town. These are not metaphors. They are documented facts. They belong in the central account of what the decade actually was. The families who lived beside Doom were not tragic figures out of mythology. They were ordinary people who trusted their government and went about their lives and grew sick and died and spent the last decades of those lives trying to understand why. Their insistence on understanding, their refusal to accept that nothing was responsible, that their cancers were simply the misfortunes of random biology, was itself a form of civic courage that the history books have not adequately honored. This has been the lost timeline. The record exists. The names are in it. The only question is whether we choose to read it.